We started this channel to bring forgotten history back to life. Subscribing helps us keep going. A man in his 60s can stand in a room full of strangers, close his eyes, and recite 40 names without pausing once. Not 40 facts, 40 ancestors. Father, grandfather, great-grandfather, back through generation after generation, in an unbroken oral chain that ends, for entire clans, for millions of people, at a single founding man believed to have crossed the Red Sea from Arabia centuries ago. This is not folklore treated loosely. It is a formal genealogical system, memorized, recited, cross-checked against elders, taught to children the way other cultures teach a national anthem. Major clan families trace their male line back to Arabian sheikhs. Some genealogies go further still, connecting that founding sheikh to the Quraysh, the tribe of the Prophet Muhammad himself. For generations, that lineage has been treated as settled fact, the backbone of identity, the answer to the question of where these people came from. Then, in 2005, a team of geneticists sat down with blood samples from 201 men from this population and ran their Y chromosomes through 45 genetic markers. The Y chromosome passes from father to son largely unchanged, generation after generation, the way a surname passes down an unbroken male line, except it is written in molecules instead of ink. If the oral genealogies were right, the signature of that line should show up clearly. It does not. Roughly 78% of the men carried a genetic marker that has been rooted in the Horn of Africa for thousands of years, long before Islam existed as a religion, long before any Arabian sheikh could have set foot on this coastline. Only around 1 in 10 carried anything resembling a lineage with plausible West Asian origin at all. If the numbers say almost none of you came from Arabia, why does every clan's family tree insist that you did? The consensus story, before anyone ran a single test tube, was built from 2 separate, well-documented threads, and both are real. The first thread is linguistic and archaeological. The language spoken across this population belongs to the Cushitic branch of the Afro-Asiatic family, a language group with deep roots in the Horn of Africa itself. Rock art at sites like Laskiel in what is now Somaliland shows detailed paintings of longhorned cattle, herders, and ritual scenes that researchers have proposed may stretch back 5,000 years or more, evidence of a pastoralist culture that predates any Arabian contact by millennia. Every strand of that evidence points to a population that has called this stretch of Africa home since long before recorded history. The second thread is historical and religious. Starting around the 10th century and accelerating through the 13th, Indian Ocean trade networks tied coastal towns like Zila, Berbera, and Mogadishu tightly to Arabia and the wider Islamic world. Traders came, religious scholars came, sheikhs came, settled, married, and are recorded in local histories as founders of new religious orders and new lineages. Over the centuries that followed, major clans built their abtersimo, their formal genealogies, linking their founding fathers directly to these arriving Arabian figures, and through them, in several of the most prominent cases, back to the Prophet's own tribal line. Put those 2 threads together and you get the accepted story. An ancient African population, converted to Islam, absorbing a handful of Arabian founding fathers whose bloodlines then multiplied outward into today's major clans. 2 of the largest clan families in the region, commonly cited in local histories as Darad and Ishaq, each maintain their own version of this founding narrative, each naming a specific sheikh, each tracing that sheikh's own ancestry back toward Arabia and, in the most detailed tellings, toward the Prophet's own Quraysh lineage. Religious scholars have taught these genealogies for generations. Clan elders have recited them at gatherings, weddings, and disputes over land and status. Because the genealogy is not just a family record, it is a legal and social one, used to settle questions of belonging. It is a clean story. It is a respectful story. It has been recited, taught, and defended for the better part of 1,000 years. But geneticists who actually typed the Y chromosomes of men across multiple clans did not find a population dominated by the genetic signature of one, or even a few, recent Arabian founding fathers. They found something else, something older, something stranger. And here is where it gets complicated. The study, led by researchers including Sanchez and colleagues, published in the European Journal of Human Genetics in 2005, is one of the most detailed Y chromosome surveys ever conducted on this population. The team genotyped 201 men using 45 biallelic markers, the genetic equivalent of 45 yes or no checkpoints along the Y chromosome, plus 11 additional short tandem repeat systems, essentially a finer-grained fingerprint layered on top of each checkpoint. 14 distinct Y chromosome haplogroups turned up in the sample. A haplogroup, for anyone unfamiliar with the term, is simply a branch on the family tree of the Y chromosome itself, a group of men who share a specific ancient mutation and therefore share a distant common male ancestor, in the same way that everyone with a particular rare surname might share one distant forefather. One branch dominated everything else. Haplogroup E3b1, now more commonly labeled E1b1b-M78, appeared in 77.6% of the men tested. Its broader parent clade, E3b as a whole, reached 81.1%. A rarer internal signature within that branch, marked by a specific allele called DYS19-11, was found in 75.1% of the male samples, a level of internal consistency that researchers do not associate with a population absorbing a late wave of foreign fathers. They associate it with deep, ancient, internal continuity. Now set that number beside the one the Arabian descent story actually needs. Haplogroup K2, one lineage with a plausible Eurasian signature, showed up in only 10.4% of the men. Haplogroup J, the branch most strongly associated with the Middle East and the Arabian Peninsula specifically. The lineage you would expect to be common if a wave of Arabian sheikhs had fathered a large share of today's population, was found in just 3.0%. 3%. Cruciani and colleagues, publishing related findings in 2004 and again in 2007, confirmed the same overwhelming EM78 dominance across the region, and proposed that its presence reflects a migration route running through Egypt and Libya into the Horn of Africa, a movement researchers place at a Bronze Age depth or earlier. Not medieval, not Arabian, ancient, and coming from the wrong direction entirely. There is one more twist buried inside the numbers, and it complicates things further rather than resolving them. Haplogroup T, carrying marker M184, the lineage with the strongest plausible tie to a West Asian origin, was found in just over 10% of men across the population as a whole, but spiked to 100% in some sampled members of the Diri clan in Djibouti. If a single Arabian founding father's bloodline had spread outward the way the genealogies describe, you would expect that signature concentrated most heavily in the clans whose oral histories claim the closest, most direct descent from an Arabian sheikh. That is not what the data shows. The clans with the strongest oral claims to a direct Arabian founding father are not, in fact, the clans carrying the highest concentration of the one lineage that could plausibly be Arabian at all. The genetic map and the genealogical map do not line up. Clean genealogy, messy genes. So if the dominant male lineage in this population predates Arabia by thousands of years, and the one signal that could genuinely be called Arabian does not track with the clans whose oral histories insist on that descent, a real question opens up, one that no amount of recited genealogy can answer on its own. Where does the story's Arabian ancestor actually come from, genetically speaking, and when did he really arrive? The first theory researchers have offered leans on exactly the ancient signal the 2005 study surfaced. Cruciani's Egypt and Libya back migration model proposes that the overwhelming bulk of the population's paternal lineage did not arrive with any medieval sheikh at all. It arrived thousands of years earlier, carried along a northeast African corridor during the spread of Neolithic-era populations moving between the Nile Valley, North Africa, and the Horn. Under this theory, the deep, dominant EM78 signature is simply the ancient backbone of the population, present long before Islam, long before any oral genealogy could have been composed to explain it. Researchers are careful to frame this as probability rather than certainty. The dating tools used to age a Y chromosome lineage rely on the accumulation of small mutations in short tandem repeats, and those mutation clocks run at variable, imprecise speeds. Cruciani's own team acknowledges that a phrase like thousands of years ago can mean anywhere from roughly 5,000 to well over 10,000 years, a window too wide to pin the ancestral migration to any single event, climate shift, or historical moment. There is a second number worth sitting with here. The haplotype diversity calculated from the Somali sample's 8 core YSTR markers came out to 0.9575, noticeably lower than the Samo 0.9974 to 0.9996 range typically seen in European and Asian populations. Lower diversity like that is the genetic fingerprint of a population bottleneck, a moment when a relatively small number of founding men's lineages expanded to fill an entire population, crowding out other bloodlines that existed before them, the way a handful of loud voices can drown out a crowded room until it sounds like only a few people are speaking. Something compressed this population's paternal diversity at some point in the past. The theory cannot yet say exactly when, or exactly why. Later studies working from smaller YSTR panels found a similar pattern. A separate sample of 147 men typed across 12 YSTR loci turned up 66 distinct haplotypes, of which 44 appeared only once, while a single haplotype recurred 26 times, accounting for nearly 18% of the entire sample on its own. That kind of lopsided repetition is, again, exactly what a strong founder effect looks like on paper. Researchers comparing this sample against two entirely separate Somali datasets found no statistically significant genetic distance between them, meaning this compressed, founder-heavy pattern is not a quirk of one research team's sampling. It shows up again and again, in population after population, across the same broad ethnic group. And that theory, however solid its ancient backbone, explains only the older layer. It says nothing about the second, more recent genetic signal buried in the same population. A real, measurable Eurasian layer that shows up clearly once researchers stop looking only at the Y chromosome and start looking at the whole genome. That layer exists. It is not folklore. It is not oral tradition. It is a datable, quantifiable genetic event. And when scientists finally sat down and dated it directly, the number that came back was nowhere near the medieval story anyone had been telling for 1,000 years. Pagani and his colleagues, publishing in 2012 in the American Journal of Human Genetics, took a different instrument to the same population. Instead of following only the Y chromosome, the single male thread passed from father to son, they looked at admixture across the whole genome, every chromosome, every inherited fragment from every ancestor, mother's side and father's side both. Think of the Y chromosome as one page torn from a much longer book. Admixture analysis reads the entire book at once, looking for chapters written in a different hand. What they found was a clear, unmistakable Eurasian chapter stitched into the genome of Horn of Africa populations, Somali and Ethiopian groups alike. And unlike the vague, wide error bar dating attached to the ancient EM78 backbone, this signal could be dated with real precision because the length of foreign DNA segments shrinks in a measurable mathematical way with each generation of intermarriage, the genetic equivalent of a photocopy fading a little more with every successive copy. Measure the fade, and you can count the copies back to the original. The number that came back, approximately 3,000 years ago. Some analyses, excluding populations with more complex double admixture histories, tightened that estimate further, to somewhere between roughly 2,600 and 3,000 years before the present. Nearly a full millennium before Islam existed as a religion. Centuries before any sheikh could have boarded any dhow bound for this coastline. Hodgson, Mulligan, Almiri, and Raum, publishing in PLOS Genetics in 2014, examined the same signal from another angle and reached a compatible conclusion, describing it as an early back-to-Africa migration, a population movement genetically linked not to Arabia specifically, but to groups related to ancient Near Eastern and Anatolian farming populations. The same broad ancestral pool that carried agriculture out of the Fertile Crescent thousands of years before the Prophet was born, before Mecca was a trading town, before the word Islam existed in any language. This is the part that should stop you. The Abtirsiamo genealogies describe 20, sometimes 30 generations back to a named Arabian founding sheikh. Run the arithmetic on 25 generations at a generous 25 years apiece, and you land somewhere around 6 centuries. Stretch it further, to 30 generations at 30 years each, and you still only reach 900 years, not 3,000, not even close. The genealogies are not merely imprecise about their Arabian founder. They are off by a factor of 5, and in some tellings, closer to a factor of 10. The math does not bend far enough to reach him. And there is a second complication buried in Pagani's own follow-up analysis, one that should unsettle the story even further. When his team traced exactly which Eurasian population this ancient genetic layer most closely resembles, the closest match was not southern Arabia. It was not Yemen, the specific region so many clan genealogies name as the ancestral homeland across the Red Sea. The closest genetic affinity ran instead to populations in Egypt and the Levant. Wrong region, wrong distance, wrong direction once again. Here is where a careful researcher has to stop and admit what the data cannot yet do. If a second, later, smaller wave of genuine Arabian gene flow did occur, tied specifically to the historic Islamic trading era, somewhere in the 9th through 13th centuries, riding the same monsoon-driven Indian Ocean trade that built ports like Zila and Old Mogadishu into wealthy, cosmopolitan towns, it would be a thin layer, a late addition, laid down over an already ancient, already dominant genetic base. and a thin, recent layer like that may simply be too faint, mathematically, to separate from the older 3,000-year-old Eurasian signal, using the tools researchers currently have. No dedicated genome-wide study has yet isolated and dated a distinct, medieval-specific, Arabian-only admixture pulse in this population. That absence is not proof the Sheik migrations never happened. It is a genuine gap in the science, an honest place where the record runs out, not a debunking. So science, for now, cannot fully confirm the Sheik migrations. It cannot fully deny them either. What it can say, with real confidence, is that the deep genetic reservoir those sheikhs would have married into was already 3,000 years old, already partly Eurasian, already carrying Egypt and Levant-linked ancestry, long before any of them set foot on this coast. Consider what a genuinely thin, late layer would even look like in the data, assuming it exists at all. A handful of founding men marrying into coastal families over 2 or 3 centuries would leave behind a signal small enough to be counted in single-digit percentages of total ancestry, concentrated most heavily in port town lineages rather than spread evenly across the interior. Researchers are careful here, because a signal that faint sits right at the edge of what current genome-wide methods can reliably separate from statistical noise. And separating a genuinely late pulse from the long tail of a 3,000-year-old admixture event, once both are present in the same population, is a technical problem nobody has yet solved for this specific region. It may be solvable with denser sampling and ancient DNA recovered directly from medieval coastal burial sites. It has not been solved yet. Picture the harbor at Old Zila, or at Mogadishu before its name meant what it means to the world today. The tide is out, and the mudflats stretch wide enough that porters wade knee-deep to load waiting dhows. It is the season when the wind has just turned. For half the year it blows one direction, carrying ships southwest, out of Arabia and down the coast. For the other half, it reverses entirely, carrying them back north again. And every trader on this coast has built an entire calendar, an entire livelihood, around waiting for that turn. Sacks of frankincense resin, pale and fragrant, are stacked beside coils of raw ivory and bundled lengths of cotton cloth. Cargo bound in every direction, toward Arabia, toward the Persian Gulf, toward India, toward the Mediterranean. The men working this harbor speak in overlapping tongues: Somali, Arabic, Persian, Gujarati, switching mid-sentence depending on who they are haggling with. Somewhere in that crowd is a scribe recording a manifest, a religious teacher newly arrived to open a small school, a ship's captain married into a local family 2 seasons ago, his children already speaking the language of the coast better than his own. Further down the quay, women sell dried fish and clarified butter to crews restocking for the next leg of the voyage. And a customs official, appointed by a local sultanate, takes his cut of the frankincense before it is allowed to leave the warehouse. None of these people think of themselves as founding a bloodline. They are working a shift, closing a deal, waiting on a wind. This is what actual historical contact between the Horn of Africa and Arabia really looked like. Not one dramatic founding father stepping off a single boat to father an entire nation, but thousands of ordinary exchanges like this one, repeated across hundreds of years, each one leaving behind a genetic trace too small to notice on its own, and only visible now because researchers can add all those traces together and measure the sum. This is where the story finally turns all the way over. The Arabian ancestor at the root of the Abtirsimo, the founding sheikh whose name every clan elder can still recite, was very likely never describing a literal, direct biological father in the way the genealogy implies. The real, measurable Eurasian thread in this population's DNA is roughly 3,000 years old, tied to ancient Near Eastern population movement that had nothing to do with Islam, nothing to do with Arabia specifically, and everything to do with a much older wave of contact between Africa and Western Eurasia. The genealogies, by contrast, describe a religiously significant figure who arrived within roughly the last 800 to 1,000 years. Not a lie, not a fabrication, a different kind of document entirely. Anthropologists who study founder genealogies across pastoral and Islamic societies worldwide have seen this exact pattern before, again and again, in unrelated populations on different continents. A genealogy like this rarely functions as a literal biological pedigree. It functions as a charter, a social and religious contract, establishing which clans belong together, which clans owe each other loyalty, and how the whole group connects itself to sacred history and religious legitimacy. The named founder is less a biological fact than a unifying idea, a peg on which centuries of alliance, land claims, and shared identity are hung. Genealogies of this kind are also living documents, not fixed ones. Branches get added, reordered, or reattached over generations as alliances shift and new clans need a place in the structure, which is itself a sign that the system was built to do social work first and record literal paternity second. A Somali historian working with these genealogies once put it plainly to a younger relative asking whether the family's Sheikh ancestor was really real. "The ancestor is real the way a flag is real," she said. "You cannot dig him up and test his bones. But the country he represents is not pretend. This does not erase the tradition, and it does not falsify 1,000 years of recited history. If anything, it reframes what that history was actually protecting." Identity here was never primarily a matter of counting one unbroken bloodline back to a single arriving man. The genes tell a different, older, and in some ways more remarkable story. A population rooted in the Horn of Africa for millennia, carrying a Eurasian thread woven into it a full 3,000 years before anyone had the writing system, the religion, or the social need to compose a genealogy explaining it at all. The same pattern surfaces almost everywhere genealogy meets genetics. Arab tribal shajara records tracing family lines back to specific pre-Islamic ancestors. European royal houses insisting on unbroken descent from figures whose historical existence is itself debated. Caste genealogies across South Asia, encoding social rank through claimed lines of descent that DNA studies routinely complicate or contradict outright. Clan origin stories among pastoralist societies from the Sahel to Central Asia, built the same way, around a named founding figure, who binds together groups that genetics later shows were never one bloodline at all. Genealogy across every one of these traditions was never really built to survive a laboratory. It was built to survive a society, to hold a group together, to answer the question of belonging long before anyone could answer the question of biology. What the DNA actually preserves is closer to a palimpsest than a family tree. An old page of parchment, scraped down and written over again and again by different hands across different centuries. Each new layer only partly hiding the one beneath it, until what remains is not one clean story but several, stacked and bleeding into each other, none of them false, none of them the whole truth on their own. So the Somali were never quite who anyone thought, not the ancient story carved into a genealogy meant to secure belonging, and not the modern one, drawn out of allele frequencies and admixture dates on a research printout. Somewhere underneath both versions, a third story is still being written, one neither the elders reciting names by the fire nor the geneticists reading percentages on a screen have finished telling.